Batgan Temujin, the unspoken promise. The message arrived without a signature, only a time and a place. The old observation platform above the Selb River at dusk. Temujin went because the handwriting, though aged and slightly unsteady, still carried the same precise slant he remembered from training reports 20 years earlier. Bat, once chief of a central district in Ulaanbaatar, now walked with a cane and kept his coat buttoned high against the evening wind. He did not waste time on greetings. "Someone knows," he said, "about the warehouse on Peace Avenue. November 1992, they have documents, photographs. They say if I do not do as they ask, the story will reach every newspaper and every enemy I ever made. My daughter teaches at the university. My grandson is applying to study abroad. This will follow them." Temujin waited. "I bent the rules," the old chief continued. "The country was coming apart. Factories closed overnight. People were hungry and angry. A group of families, teachers, nurses, a few low-level clerks had taken shelter in that warehouse with what little food they had. A rival faction wanted them cleared out as an example. I had orders to support the clearance. Instead, I delayed the operation by 14 hours and quietly moved the families out through a service entrance. No one died. No one was arrested. On paper, the building was simply found empty. I filed the report myself." He looked at the dark water. "I told myself it was the only decent choice. Now someone calls it a betrayal." The blackmailer had left a single contact method, a public email address that routed through 3 countries. Temujin did not reply at once. He spent 2 days reading archived newspapers, talking to retired officers who still owed him quiet favors, and walking the streets that had changed so much since the early 90s. The past was not buried in Mongolia. It simply lived in smaller rooms. He found the man in a modest apartment block on the city's north side. His name was Gantolga. In 1992, he had been 23, a junior warehouse clerk whose older brother had been among those ordered to clear the building. When the operation was delayed and the families vanished, the brother had been blamed for incompetence, then dismissed, then quietly blacklisted. He had drunk himself to death 5 years later. Gantolga had spent the decades since collecting every scrap of paper that might prove the delay had not been accidental. He did not want money. He wanted the old chief to stand in a public square and admit that he had chosen some lives over others, that the system's orders had been ignored, and that his brother's ruin had been the price. "I don't care if the families lived," Gantolga said when Temujin finally sat across from him. "I care that my brother was discarded so someone else could feel righteous." Temujin did not argue the morality of the original decision. He had lived long enough to know that in those years, almost every choice left someone behind. Instead, he asked questions that moved sideways. What would your brother have done if he had been the one inside the warehouse with his own children? Gantolga's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. "And what do you gain?" Temujin continued. "If the man who saved those families is destroyed in public, and the families themselves are dragged back into a story they have spent 30 years trying to forget." The conversations continued over 3 evenings. Temujin never raised his voice. He brought no threats and no offers of payment. He simply kept returning the discussion to the living rather than the dead. Slowly, Gantolga's demand began to change shape. Public confession would satisfy anger, but it would also guarantee that the old wound stayed open for another generation. What he truly wanted, Temujin suggested, was for the weight of the past to be acknowledged by the one person who still carried it, without turning that acknowledgement into a second punishment for people who had already suffered enough. On the 4th evening, Gantolga agreed to a private meeting. They met in a closed side room of a quiet monastery on the edge of the city. Only 4 people were present: the retired chief, Gantolga, Temujin, and a monk who would speak to no one afterward. Bat told the full story without excuse or embellishment. He named the families he had moved. He described the order he had delayed and the report he had falsified. He said that he had carried the knowledge every day since, and that he had never once believed it made him heroic, only responsible. Gantulga listened without interrupting. When it was finished, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he took the folder of documents from his coat and placed it on the low table between them. "Burn them," he said, "or keep them, I don't want them any more." He stood, nodded once to Temujin, and left. Afterward, in the monastery courtyard, Erdingbat looked older than he had at the river. "You could have forced a different ending," he said. Temujin shook his head. "Force would only have made another secret. This way the debt is spoken and then set down. That is as close to clean as the past usually allows." The old chief studied him for a moment. "You always did prefer the solutions that left the fewest new scars." Temujin did not reply. Loyalty, he had learned, sometimes meant protecting a man from the consequences of a choice that had been right enough in its time, and sometimes meant protecting the people that choice had saved from having their lives reopened for the sake of someone else's unresolved grief. Both could be true at once. The work was to hold the contradiction without letting it harden into fresh harm. He walked the old chief to a waiting car and watched it disappear into the city traffic. The unspoken promise that had bound them years earlier, mentor to student, officer to officer, had been kept, not by silence, but by the careful decision of when silence was no longer required. Above the monastery roof, the first stars of evening appeared, indifferent and clear.